What's up, everyone? This is Nate Morris, MasterLSAT.com, and in this video, we're going to master the third logic game from the May 2020 LSAT-Flex. So if you haven't already taken that test, follow the link in the description below, try it first on your own, and then we'll master all the questions you had trouble with together. And you can use the timestamps below to jump to specific questions. We have 6 meetings being held in the next school year, 3 in the fall and 3 in the spring. So right away, it sounds like a grouping game. It sounds like we are sorting some things into the fall group and some things into the spring group. And what are those things? What are those variables that we're sorting out? The following 5 cities, because each meeting will be hosted by one of these 5 cities: Honolulu, Montreal, etc. So those are our list of variables, right? As always, we start off by writing out the variables by their first letter for reference: H, M, O, T, and V. And some of them are going to have meetings hosted in the fall. So we'll have F for fall group and S for spring group, right? And there are 3 in each. 3 in each group. This is always how we show that. And of course, there are 5 variables, right? Which means we're going to have to repeat one of them, right? It says each city hosting at least 1 meeting. So there are 1 plus of each, 1 or more of each variable. And really, we can notice, and we should hopefully notice at the beginning, that one of these 5 things is going to be doubled, right? Because we have 6 spots to fill, 3 in each of 2 groups. But we only have 5 letters to use to fill those spots. So we have to use all 5 at least once, and then one of them we will have to use twice. It is always good to notice numerical realities like that at the beginning of games like this, where the numbers don't quite add up, where we have 5 variables, but 6 spots to fill. That means we are going to have to double one of them. So one of those 5 things is going to have to be in both fall and spring, right? One of them will have to be in both groups, and the other 4 are going to be just singles, right? And it says no city will host more than 1 meeting per semester. So that's what we would have expected, right? We can't have O be in the same group twice, right? So the one that's doubled is going to be, let's say it's O, it's going to be in both groups, and then everything else will be a single, right? And that's how we will make up our total of 6 spots being filled up. Anyway, hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and write out the rules. Our first 2 rules are simple conditional rules. We've seen many of these. If Honolulu is in the fall, then Montreal has to also be in the fall. So since this rule is about the F group, we show it under the F group. If H is there, then M is there. The arrow means if then. And similarly, the next rule, very similar. If Vancouver's in the spring, then Tampa has to be in the spring. Same idea. If V, then T in the spring. And finally, in both groups, in each semester, there has to be M or V or both. So let's write that in both of them. M/V/both in the fall, M/V/both in the spring. That is it for our setup. We're going to box this off, and now let's go ahead and look at the questions. Number 12 starts us off right off the bat with an if question, if the only M is in the spring. So as you can see, we start off by writing that out, making the if true, as we always do. And of course, it tells us 2 things, not just that M is in the spring, but also that M is not in the fall. Now, are there any inferences here? If we look at the rules, does this tell us anything? Well, I see M is in a couple of rules. First of all, both groups have to have an M or a V or both. Now, we've taken care of that in the spring, but the fall won't have M, which means the fall has to have V in order to satisfy this rule. So we can start with that. But there's also another rule with M in it, and that's this conditional rule. And as you can see, that rule is also triggered because if the end of the arrow is false, right? If M is not there, then the beginning of the arrow must be false as well. H must not be there either. That's always true of any conditional statement. If the end of the statement is false, if the end of the conditional rule is false, that means the beginning has to be false also, because if the beginning were true, that would force the end to be true, right? If H were there, that would force M to be there, but we know that M is not there, which means H must not be there either, because that would bring M in, which we know is not the case. So therefore, H is also not in the fall. And once you know that M and H are both not in the fall, that only leaves 3 other letters in existence who therefore all have to go in the fall, because both groups always need 3 letters in them. So if it's not M and H, It must therefore be O, T, and V. So we know the entire group. So therefore, let's go ahead and put that in. We know that fall is O, T, and V, which means let's look at the spring now. We haven't placed H yet anywhere. So since H is not going in the fall because the fall is full, H will have to go in the spring. And now we have one of each of the 5 variables. So therefore, for our final spot in the spring, we will have to double something from the fall. At first glance, it could be O, V, or T. But then when we look at the rules, we notice that it can't be V because V would bring in T as well, and that would overload the group. And therefore, it can't be V, but it could be T or O. And that is going to be everything that we know for number 12. As you can see, we made the if true, we looked for inferences, and we figured out everything. So therefore, let's just go ahead and glance through the answer choices. We don't have to test anything out. We just have to look for the one that could be true based on what we have on the page. A, could H be in both semesters? No, we can see that there is no H in the fall, so A is impossible. B, could T be in both semesters? Yes, that is possible, and therefore B is the answer, and we are done. Let's look at the other 3. C, could H be only in the fall? No, H can't even be in the fall at all, as we can see. So C is impossible. D, could O be only in the spring? No, because O is definitely in the fall as well. And same thing with E. Could T be only in the spring? No, because T must be in the fall, as we can see. So therefore, B is the only one that could be true in number 12. Number 13, if O hosts 2 of the meetings, so we start off, as you can see, by making that if true. We put O in both semesters, and we look for inferences. Do the rules tell us anything else that has to be the case here? The answer seems to be no, because O is not in any of the rules, so it doesn't seem that any of the rules are triggered by putting O in both semesters. And therefore, since we can't see any obvious inferences, let's go ahead and move on to step 2, right? That's always plan B, which is to test out the answer choices. Now, this says which of the following must be true. So what we always have to do on must be true questions is try to disprove them, try to make each one false, right? So let's take a look at A. Can we make A false? Does H have to be in the fall, or could H not be in the fall? Now, we have a little bit of a shortcut because in number 12, as we can see, O could have been in both groups. And so therefore, any of these answer choices that we've made false in number 12 will not be the answer because they've already been disproven. And it's always important to keep an eye open for that so that you can save yourself a bit of time. So Honolulu was not in the fall. We made A false in number 12, right? Omaha was hosting 2 meetings and H was not in the fall. And therefore, we already know that A doesn't have to be true if O hosts 2 in the meetings, and therefore we can skip A. We can cross it off right off the bat. We don't have to test it out because we already did inadvertently test it out in number 12. B, unfortunately, we did make true in number 12, as we did with C as well. But D we made false in number 12. D says H and V go together into the same semester. And we didn't do that in number 12. H and V were separate, as you can see in number 12. They were not in the same semester. And O was, or at least could have been hosting 2 of the meetings, right? That T/O was an option. And so since Omaha could have hosted 2 meetings and V and H were separate, that means that D doesn't have to be true either, which means we can right off the bat narrow it down to B, C, and E, because unfortunately all 3 of B, C, and E were all true in number 12. So we do have to test out a couple of those, but that's still great that we had a shortcut that we can cross off 2 answers right off the bat within just a few seconds of noticing that. So let's go ahead and start with B. We're going to try to make B false. Does it have to be true that Tampa is in the fall? Let's try to not put Tampa in the fall. We'll put Tampa in the spring instead. So we have the 2 O's there, and we're putting Tampa in the spring. Let's go ahead and put V in the spring also, since we know that that would follow that VT rule because T's already there. So we might as well just make sure that that's taken care of. We have to put an M or a V there anyway. So let's put V and T both in the spring, and we can go ahead and put H and M in the fall, and that would also work because H brings in M, and that's fine. And therefore, we can show that B could be false. Tampa was not in the fall here, and therefore we can cross B off because we just made it false, which means it's not something that must be true. We also made C false, right? We weren't even trying, but C says Montreal's in the spring. We just put Montreal only in the fall. So in testing out B, we also inadvertently tested out C, which happens a lot of the time, and that's why you always have to keep your eyes open for that. So look at that. A and D we had already done. All we had to do is B here, because in doing B, we proved that C also could be false, and therefore that leaves us with E by process of elimination. So we are done the question because A, B, C, and D can all be false, which means the only one that could possibly be something that must be true is E. Now, if for whatever reason you wanted to test out E to see why E must be true, let's go ahead and see what that would have looked like. E says T and V are in the same semester. So if we start off with those two O's, if we don't put T and V in the same semester, well, that would mean that we couldn't put V in the spring, because if V were in the spring, then T would have to also be in the spring, and they would be in the same semester. So we'd have to split them up like such. We'd have to put V over there and T over there. And now, since we're not putting V in the spring, M would have to be in the spring because both groups need an M or a V, as we can see from this rule. And that only leaves one letter left, H. So H will have to go into the fall. And of course, you can hopefully now see why this won't work, because according to this rule, H would bring in M as well, which obviously would overload that group, and therefore this doesn't work. But of course, we already knew that it wasn't going to work. Let's look at number 14. Which of the following cannot be true? Which of the following cannot be an accurate partial matching of cities with semesters? Since there's no if statement, we have to go straight to testing these out. We are going to try to make each one true and look for the one that doesn't work. And of course, there's always a shortcut, which is, have we made this answer choice true in the past? Whichever answer choice we're looking at, have we made it true in the past? In which case, we don't have to do it again. We already know that it works, right? So let's start with A. A says H in the fall and H and V in the spring. Looking at our page, looking at 12 and 13, it looks like, unfortunately, we've never done that before. So let's go ahead and test that out. H in the fall, H and V in the spring. Now, if H is in the fall, that will go ahead and trigger that rule, and will have to also be in the fall. If V is in the spring, that triggers that rule. So T has to go in the spring, and we've placed everything except for O. So O will have to go in the fall. And it looks like we followed all the rules, right? We have an M or V in both groups, and therefore A works, and it's not the answer because we're looking for what cannot be true. Now let's move on to B. B says M in the fall and H and T in the spring. Wait a second, we just did that 3 seconds ago. When we did A, we put M in the fall and we put H and T in the spring, which means B is also something that can be true, and hopefully we will notice that so that we don't have to actually test it out again, as we just did notice that. So we don't have to test B out again because we just did it when we did A. So let's move on to C. O in the fall and M and T in the spring. That we have also already done, except this time it's in a previous question. In number 12, O was in the fall and M was in the spring, and T at least could have been in the spring. That was an option, as we can see. And therefore C, we could have made true in number 12, which means we don't have to do it again. We already know that it works. So we tested out A. We inadvertently tested out B when we tested out A. C, we have inadvertently already done in another question. So all three of these work, and therefore they are not the answer. Let's look at D. H and T in the fall and M in the spring. This, unfortunately, we've never done before, so let's try it out. Now, if H is in the fall, that triggers this rule. That means M has to also be in the fall, which means the fall is full. That's H, T, and M. We have not placed V yet, so V would have to go in the spring, which would trigger this rule, which means T has to also go in the spring, which fills everything up. Now, what's the problem is we haven't placed O anywhere, right? We doubled two letters. We doubled T and we doubled M, and O isn't going anywhere, and therefore this doesn't work, and therefore that's the answer. D cannot be true. Let's look at E. If for whatever reason you wanted to test out E, E says H and V in the fall. Let's see why that's not something that cannot be true. H and V in the fall, V in the spring brings in T in the spring, and then we are missing O and M. M would have to go in the fall because H brings in M, and then O would go in the spring, and that would work. So E, of course, works as well. Of course, we didn't have to test that out because we already knew that D was the answer anyway, but I just wanted to show what that would have looked like. 15, which of the following cannot be true, cannot be in either semester, the group of the three meetings? So either the fall or the spring. So in order to test this out, to test these answer choices out, we just have to make it true in one of the two groups to prove that it's not the answer, because whatever the right answer is cannot be true in either semester. So let's look at A, H, M, and T. Have we ever done that before? The answer is yes. If you look at number 12, we could have made the spring be H, M, and T, right? The T/O was an option, but it at least could have been the case. And since we've already done that, or we at least could have made A true in the past, we know that it's not the answer. We know that H, M, and T can be the group, at least for the spring, at least from that one scenario in number 12. So we can go ahead and skip A. What about B, H, M, and V? From a quick glance at the page, it doesn't look like we've done that before, so let's go ahead and test that out. H, M, and V, which semester should we put that in? Well, if we put it in the spring, it would violate this rule because V would bring T in also, right? And that would be too many letters. So therefore, if B is to work, it would have to be in the fall. So far, it works in the fall because H brings in M, so that's fine. That follows this rule. And we have M and V, so that certainly follows this rule. What are we missing? O and T. So O and T will have to both go in the spring. And we've placed everything. And we need either an M or a V in the spring. It could be either one. It could be V because there's a T there. Or it could also just be M, right? If we want to, we can trigger this rule because there's a T there, but we don't have to. So it could be M or V. Either way, it works, and therefore B is not the answer. What about C? H, O, and V. Now, once again, just like B, H, O, and V could not be in the spring for the same reason, because if H, O, and V went into the spring, that would bring in T, and that would overload that group. But it also couldn't be in the fall, because if we put H, O, and V in the fall, H would bring in M, and that would overload that group. And therefore, neither of these two groups can house H, O, and V, and therefore C cannot be true. Just from looking at the rules, we see that pretty quickly, and therefore C is the answer. Let's take a look at D and E. Even though we're done the question, let's go ahead and look at those two answer choices in case you happen to have picked one of them. D says H, T, and V. Have we done that before? Yes, we did that in number 14. H, T, and V were all together in number 14, and therefore we have proven that that works, so it's not the answer. What about M, O, V? That it doesn't look like we've done before. E, it doesn't look like we've done before. But it could work. It would have to be in the fall, because if it were in the spring, then V would bring in T. But if we did it in the fall, M, O, and V, then we haven't placed T or H yet, so we'd have to put them in the spring. And we need an M or a V in the spring, but it could be either one, right? If it were V, that's fine because there's a T there. So there are two ways to make E true, and therefore E is not the answer. It could be true, but of course we already knew that because we already knew that C cannot be true. Number 16 gives us an if statement. If Tampa hosts two of the meetings. So without even thinking, we go ahead and make that true. Now let's look at the rules to see if we can find any inferences. It doesn't seem like we can because T is only in one rule. And just because we made the end of that arrow true doesn't mean the beginning has to be true, because that's not how conditional logic works. If V were there, T would have to be there. But if T is there, that doesn't mean that V has to be there. Right? Either way, whether V went in that group or not, that rule would be followed. And therefore, it doesn't seem that there are any easy inferences here. So let's go ahead and move on to step 2, which is testing out the answer choices, which is making them true, because this is a which of the following could be true question. So we are going to test them out one at a time to look for the one that works. A, we're going to try to make A true and see if it works. Could H and V both go in the fall? We should see pretty quickly that that doesn't work because H would bring M in as well, and that would of course be too many letters for that group, so therefore A is impossible. B, could M and O both be in the fall? If M and O were in the fall, then we have T, M, and O in the fall. That's fine. We have an M or a V in the fall, so that follows that MV rule. And we didn't trigger the HM conditional rule. Now let's look at the spring. We are missing V. We have to place V, and we're also missing H. We have to place H in the spring. And it's okay that V's there because V brings in T. And we have an M or a V in the spring. So we followed all of the rules, and therefore B is the correct answer. It works, and we are done the question. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and see what it would have looked like to test out the remaining 3 answer choices. C, could M and V both go into the fall? Well, at first glance, that doesn't break any rules But the problem here is that we have two letters remaining, O and H. They will have to both go in the spring. And we have violated this rule. We don't have an M or a V in the spring, and therefore that doesn't work. Let's go ahead and look at D, M, and O in the spring. Well, if we have M and O in the spring, that means that H and V would have to go into the fall because they are the only two letters left, and H would bring in M, which would overload that group, so that doesn't work either. And finally, E, M, and V in the spring. If M and V are in the spring, V brings in T because of that rule, but that's okay because T is already there. And what are we missing? We're missing O and H. They would have to both go in the fall. H would have to bring in M because of that rule, and that would overload that group. Also, there's no M or V in the fall, so it breaks two rules, and that's why that doesn't work. So as you can see, C, D, and E are all impossible, but of course we already knew that was going to be the case because we already knew that B was the answer. Number 17, final question on this game. If H is in the fall, so we go ahead and make that if true without even thinking about anything else. We make the if true, and now we look for inferences. So we made the if true over here, as you can see, and let's look at the rules. This certainly triggers this rule. If H is there, then M has to be there also. But it doesn't seem that there's anything else obvious we can figure out from this, right? It seems like that's pretty much all the inferences. So let's go ahead and move on to step 2, which is testing out the answer choices. Which of the following must be true? So we test these out by making them false, right? We want to try to disprove that it must be true by doing the opposite. A, does O have to be in the fall? Now, here's the good news. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scenarios already on the page from the past 5 questions. So we can go ahead and look at past questions to see if we've ever made A false with Honolulu being in the fall. The answer is yes. In number 15, we put H in the fall, and O was not in the fall. So we've already made A false, and therefore we know that A is not the answer. So we can move on to B. B says M is in the spring. Looking back at that same question, 15, we had Honolulu in the fall, and M could have been in the spring, but it didn't have to be in the spring. That was an M/V, and therefore B could have been false in number 15, right? H was in the fall, and Montreal didn't have to be in the spring, which proves that B is not the answer either. So that's good news. We are already on C, and we haven't even done anything yet. What about C? If H is in the fall, does O have to be in the spring? The answer is no. Let's look at 14. In 14, H was in the fall, and as you can see, there's no O in the spring. And therefore, C, we have also made false. So that is pretty good news. And since we are on a roll, let's look at these remaining 2 answer choices to see if we've made either of these false in the past with Honolulu being in the fall. And the answer seems to be yes. E, in number 15, H was in the fall, and Vancouver could have been in the spring, but didn't have to be in the spring, and therefore E could have been false in number 15. And so without doing anything, as long as you just look at past questions, and specifically just these 2 questions were all you had to look at to prove that A, B, C, and E all could be false, right? Honolulu was in the fall, and all 4 of those answer choices could have been false. And by process of elimination, therefore, we know that D is the answer without even trying it. Let's test out D anyway, just to see what that would have looked like, just to see why it must be true. D says Tampa has to be in the spring. So, of course, we're starting off with H and M in the fall. And D says Tampa's in the spring, so let's try to not put Tampa in the spring. So that would mean that Tampa would be in the fall. And that would mean that the spring, since the spring doesn't have Tampa, it can't have V either, because V would bring in Tampa, which means the spring has to be the other 3 letters. If it's not V or T, it must be H, M, and O. What's the problem here? Can you spot it? The problem is that we have doubled 2 letters. We've doubled H, and we've doubled M, which means we have totally left out V, right? V is nowhere to be found here, and that's why this doesn't work. D does not work, right? If we make D false, it doesn't work, and therefore, since we can't make it false, it must be true, and therefore is the correct answer. That is it for number 17, and that also marks the end of this logic game. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.